You're now listening to the Diversity Roundtable. I'm Pamela Xaba, entrepreneur, inclusion enthusiast, and the founder of Nonkosi Creatives with over 2 decades as a corporate HR professional. My goal is to give you insights into conversations with entrepreneurs and corporate professionals who have insightful stories of triumph and leadership. I uncover my personal journey from cultivating diversity and promoting inclusive communities. We'll also find out why building a prosperous society is vital for leadership roles. Subscribe and get ready to rise, lead, and help define the spirit of South African excellence. So good day. Thank you for coming in. Thank you for tuning in. I am your host, Pamela Xaba, for the Diversity Roundtable. We are on episode 22. This is the final week of November 2024. The year is almost over, and we are recording our final episode for the year and closing the year with a bang with the most amazing, fabulous lady. I'll introduce her shortly. So she's really one of our distinguished HR leaders in the country. She won CHRO of the Year in 2022. Miss Njabulo Mashigo, welcome. Thank you for joining us. We are really blessed. We are really honored to have you today. So I think briefly start by introducing yourself. Tell us who you are, your background, whatever it is that you are comfortable sharing with our listeners and our viewers today. We are just really, really so privileged to have you. So over to you, Sisi.
Thank you so much, Pam.
Yes.
Very excited to be here.
Yeah.
And greetings to everybody listening and viewing. Njabulo Mashigo. I've been in HR for 22 years this year. So it's not just only episode 22, but I guess a special number for me as well.
Oh, yeah.
Sure, about myself, I always say I'm a Gautenga because I was born in Alexandra, grew up in Soweto and the East Rand, so really a Gauteng girl, so this is home for me. I have always been in HR and been a corporate career girl and loving it so far.
Oh my, thank you so much. But I think just tell us also into just a bit of detail about you, right? So what is the one thing that you really, really would like our viewers and our listeners to know about you? You know, that's something that we don't know. I know I follow you on social media, you know, and at some stage I think I saw on your Facebook that your daughter speaks French.
Yeah.
So maybe can you enlighten us how that came about?
Yeah, I was actually thinking, I wonder how many things people don't know about me, because I feel like I've shared quite a bit.
Yeah.
But perhaps that I've got a daughter.
Yes.
She's actually turning 19
Yeah.
this week on Friday. Definitely my pride and joy. My only child. So some people sometimes are surprised that I don't have a bigger family. Some people are surprised because they found out that I do have a daughter. So that's something interesting.
Yeah.
She speaks, French, a bit of Spanish, but I don't know what other interesting thing I could share. I don't speak those languages. I tried to speak French and it was very difficult for me.
Yeah.
So it's still somewhere on my to-do list.
Yes.
I'm divorced that's really maybe a bit more about myself that people might not know.
Yes. So just tell us more about your HR career, you know, maybe paint a journey for us, because now you're really this really successful HR leader in our country, as I've alluded to earlier. But, you know, one wonders, the reason why we started this podcast, Njabulo, was to really inspire young professionals, up-and-coming entrepreneurs, mainly from marginalized communities, previously disadvantaged communities. So one would wonder that, okay, here's Njabulo in 2024, and she's done and she's doing and she continues to do really wonderful things. But how did your journey actually start? You know, so talk to a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old or an 18-year-old Njabulo out there who's looking at you today in all of the platforms and the media platforms that you get featured on to say, yo, really, what an inspiration you are. But how did you start? You know, paint us a picture for us. I know that over 2 decades is quite a long time, but then just try and summarize it for us.
Yeah, I would say a good summary of
Yeah.
my career is that it's really been marked by a lot of early starts.
Yeah.
So just starting with school, I started school when I was 4. I was in
Yeah.
matric at the age of 16.
Yeah.
So that is probably somewhat unusual.
Yes, it is.
And that's when I went to Rhodes University, graduated with my undergrad when I was 19. So that
Wow.
was also quite something.
Yes.
And I think the early starts have really marked, I would say, my career. So because starting as a 19-year-old, as a graduate with Unilever, fast forward to where I am today, it's really been a remarkable career. Some aspects of my career, I think even myself have been surprised. And I think, definitely I consider myself blessed. And I think what really helped is starting with organizations that take the people agenda and human resources quite seriously. I think we're in a profession where sometimes, even today, unfortunately, some people still minimize what HR is really about, or they think we just count leave days and manage payroll.
Yes.
And what's been amazing for me has been just really with the blessing of starting in an organization where HR was an equal, fully embraced. I think that just set me up to succeed, because by the time I moved on and went to organizations that didn't value HR, it was too late. I already believed in myself and the value and the contribution that I was there to make. And lastly, I would say, if I were to package my career, I would say the first 7 years in the FMCG space, FMCG manufacturing. I've spent about another 7 years in financial services / regulatory spaces. Back to FMCG for 5 years, and then now in telecoms. I like to bucket it into those kind of 4 portions to digest the 22 years. So it's been varied, but really exposed to some incredible organizations.
Wonderful, wonderful. So before we get into today's topic that I will introduce shortly, so I think I'm also intrigued because you've also worked outside of the country at some point, right? So talk to us about that opportunity for a young professional that's sitting out there. How do those opportunities come about, and what was out of that experience, what message can you share with our viewers in that context?
So one of my favorite things that I like to say is that don't stop working hard. In the moment, it might not feel like all the puzzle pieces are adding up together, but sometimes you'll be surprised that somebody's watching. So for me, when I had the opportunity to live and work internationally, it was when I was with Heineken. And what was great about that opportunity is that how I got into the organization. I was in one organization, got a call from a headhunter who said, we've been watching your great work. We believe that you've got amazing potential. And that's why I say you'd be surprised by actually who is watching you. And that's why you need to stay on the task and stay focused. That's really my big advice. We can get very despondent or even distracted because maybe you think all your fortune is here, but maybe it's somewhere else. But by actually putting in the focus here and the energy and the hard work here, it's going to pay off in another space. And so joining that organization, which was a multinational, also joining what seemed like a startup, and I think it was a startup in the South Africa context, but part of a bigger global organization that was hundreds of years old. And so once again, that decision to say, again, you could just look at this immediate startup or see the bigger picture. And for me, for doing my very best when I entered into that organization, within 18 months, they were like, actually, you should be coming to global head office because we believe you can do so much more. And so I did have that opportunity to live in the Netherlands. I lived in Amsterdam for 3 years and really came back home out of a personal decision around COVID. I think I had an opportunity, again, from a career's point of view, where there was somebody watching me and saying, don't you want to come back
home and do this?
But, and at first I said no, by the way, but definitely COVID was a motivator, because I think 1 year into COVID, sitting in my apartment, don't know when it's going to end. At the end of 2020, I said, maybe I need to go home. And that was also just the blessing of how opportunities just keep on opening up, purely based on how you show up as a professional. Yeah.
No, that's really wonderful. So, to our listeners and our viewers, indeed, life is a journey. Just listen to the inspiring story that Njabulo has shared with us. But before I forget, right, last week you received the Dean's Award. It gives
Yes.
congratulations.
Thank you.
First and foremost, and well done. That is
Thank
just
you.
a testament of the excellent work that you continue to do.
Thank you.
Can you just maybe tell us briefly about that and how that came about?
Yeah, so it really was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah.
But what the Dean's Award is,
Yeah.
I've been to a few of the year-end functions
Yeah.
because we've been partnering with Gibbs. But
Yeah.
the Dean always has, the Dean's Award, which each year he will decide which organization to award it to,
Yeah.
and also which aspects of excellence he wants to recognize.
Yes.
So in this case, it was excellence in partnerships,
Yeah.
and it was really just recognizing the partnership that we've had with Gibbs over the years,
Yes.
in terms of co-creating our leadership development program.
Uh-huh.
A few years ago, he posed a challenge to us on the quality of the people we're bringing into the program. What
Yeah.
do we really want to get out of it? And it coincided very well with us also just reshaping our organization.
Yep.
And I think it was really special because I think
Yeah.
both sides have worked very hard,
Yes.
both the institution and ourselves, in terms of just really saying, how can we co-create something?
Yeah.
Which I actually think fits in quite well with the theme for today,
Yes.
in terms of just collaboration and how we can actually create together.
Yes. No, that's really beautiful. So let's get into today's topic because I think, you are such an inspiration. So I don't want to probe and ask you another question. Actually forget that we've got a topic that we need to discuss. So to our listeners and viewers, the topic that we'll be unpacking with Njabulo today is evolving diversity from visible differences to cognitive inclusion. So before we get into the nitty-gritties of the topic, why does this topic resonate with you? What does it mean for you? Yeah.
I think it resonates for many reasons. And I think just one, my own personal journey. So we've just remarked on a 22-year career.
Yes.
Definitely not an easy career to build. I think in the context of both corporate South Africa, but even globally. You can imagine starting a career as a 19-year-old black female, and for a lot of people, they just see this little girl.
Yes.
And even fast forward to the time where by 29, 30, I was at a director level, some people were just still seeing this little girl. And when you sit in a boardroom and you are amongst the youngest, if not the youngest, quite often, with 50-plus-year-olds, and also I would say corporate South Africa, because South Africa is racially charged, unfortunately, also being a black female. And I do remember one of my earliest exco experiences being the only African female, and definitely the youngest. And you just feel completely out. And then also then having this burden, and at the time it felt like a burden, but I think now it's a bit more of a mission. People approaching you and saying, oh, finally, Njabulo, you're here. Now you can break doors for us.
Now you feel like you are carrying everyone on your shoulders. It's like you're a poster child for blackness in the boardroom.
And it's quite a lot of pressure.
It is.
Particularly when you also haven't gained your own confidence, and you're also trying to prove yourself, and you're trying to show that I deserve to be here. I'm not just here because whatever. And so you're focused on that and peddling. And then there's other people who are standing waiting like, okay, so when are you going to
do something?
Open doors for us, you know? And so it's always been something that's been fascinating. I think seeing corporate South Africa wrestling with diversity inclusion, some people bringing in tokenism, just be there to fill the quotas. We have 3 females, that's enough. We've got black people, that's enough. But people really not being welcome to have a view, to have an opinion, to be part of decision making. And so yes, I do think it's something that I've experienced from the front row. And then of course by virtue of being a custodian of the people agenda, you also carry it in terms of maybe the mandate, whether it's culture, whether it's diversity and inclusion, whether it's employment equity if you're in South Africa. So from different perspectives, but certainly it's been something that I've become very acquainted with in terms of what does it really take for people to thrive and to belong.
No, you actually really, thank you for sharing this, Njabulo, because it's not a lot of people that have actually or have got into a space where they're comfortable talking about, their struggles in that context and how they experience certain things, right? But also, again, it's about how you navigate that space, isn't it? It's about how you deal with it. It's about how you deal with the challenges when they come, right? So you mentioned that you were among the youngest, when you get to a certain point on that boardroom table, right? So then can you just talk to us about, how the different generations view diversity in that perspective? We've got the millennials, we've got the Gen Zs, but then we've got the baby boomers and everyone. So how in your experience, because you've been the youngest on the boardroom table and you've seen other people that are much older, you're sitting on the same table. And what did that say to you? How did you navigate that space? And how do you think that those different generations view diversity in that context?
Yeah. So firstly, with classifying myself, so technically a millennial because the age group is from 1980 to 1995, I think.
Yeah.
And then the Gen Zs follow. I think one of the things that's quite clear in terms of the definition of diversity inclusion is that it's evolving. And I do think the generations have different perspectives. The older generations tend to look at it from a moral perspective, and it's very much based on the external visible things. So which is why, and I think in a country again like South Africa where race is a big issue, gender is another one, is it's also become the big focus about racial representation. If you take the BE definition, then you slice it even further, African, colored, Indian. We've got the representation, so we're fine. Or now we've got women. Disability or people with disability or living with disabilities is a big topic. And so the older generation, the emphasis is more on the external things that we can see. And I think that moral obligation to be seen to be doing the right thing. But as I've asked, it's one thing to have all these diverse people around a table. But do you really... are they allowed to bring their best? And I think with the newer generations, I think millennials were somewhere in the middle. We're like the old of the young and the young of the old. We're not quite young anymore, but with millennials and the generations that come after us, it's much more about the feels, as I like to say. The young people these days, they talk about the vibes and the feels. It's not just about what things look like, but it's actually how they feel. And that's where we get into this world around cognitive diversity. Because again, you can have two young men like we have in the studio today, but are they the same person? And do they see the world in the same way? And is it fair to just say, well, we've got black male representation and that's enough? In reality, you've got individuals, and many things inform our individuality. And so the newer definition and the evolving definition is about appreciating that, the fact that once you get into the invisible space, there's actually so much more to unpack. Whether you talk about neurodiversity, people living with ADHD, people who are dyslexic, etc., or you're just talking about just thinking differently. Some are more creative, some are more scientific in how they look at things, more black and white. But at the end of the day, it's just recognizing that it takes a lot more than how we've just summarized it to be about race, gender, and how the different smarties are in the box. But it's about opening up that world.
No, you're absolutely right. And it definitely resonates with me and Njabulo because, it's one thing to say, look, we've got a diverse workforce, we've got black, colored, and Indian and so forth. But then, how do we make sure that people bring their authentic selves into this space, because even if we say, we are all African, we are all black, in that context, we are also very diverse, right? Because then if we start breaking it down, so how do even then organizations grapple with the concept of then inclusion and belonging in that context? So and we often talk about personalizing employee experience, but then how does that look like in practice? you know, because we are so different.
Yes.
You know, so at what point do we start and at what point do we stop?
Yeah.
Because it's so broad.
Yeah. That's an interesting one, you know. So chatting to just some colleagues in the HR fraternity, you know, one of my colleagues recently said, I think we're doing too much. Like, people want too much from the employment experience and too much from companies, you know?
Yes.
And then, you know, another colleague was saying, but if you're going to spend so much time at work, you also need to feel like you belong. And I think that's exactly the tension about employment. And I think maybe before coming back to your question, just for me, an additional context I would add, which maybe leads me to my answer, is the traditional employer-employee relationship has changed. You know, people are questioning this whole employment thing. I think, yes, COVID was probably a start where, and I'm sure it's been happening before, but at least people were more vocal and honest about the fact that, you know, is work the most important thing? How do you gain fulfillment? It takes up so much of our time. How do we bring our whole selves to work? And I just find that's the first part, is acknowledging the employer-employee dynamic has shifted. And then I think coming closer to your question is how do we deal with it? I think it's about co-creating. And understanding, and when you look actually at the commercial organization or generally how businesses are run, I would say that we already have a model. You know, just like in the same way that the whole concept of employee experience was actually borrowed or taken out of originally customer experience, right? If for us in my organization, we've borrowed a similar thinking around when you think about micro segmentation, as you would normally typically would do with the customers, and say, if I'm selling a product and I wanted to talk to young people, what does it look like? For older people, what do they want? They want ease, they want access, they want this and that. Hyper-personalization from an employee experience perspective is exactly about that. I think firstly, it's just about knowing and understanding your population, who makes up your organization. I think, and what I would say to HR practitioners is you don't have to have all the answers. You can co-create. And again, at the end of the day, we are an organization. It's not about fulfilling the wish list of all the things that all the different categories of people want. But once you have a very good understanding of who makes up the organization, then you know, if I've got a youth population, how do I become more appealing to them? In my organization, we've made a decision around a couple of segments of people. One is the youth, because they are the pipeline for the future for our organization, and we've got a big youth population. We've made decisions around women, because we do have a broader gender agenda, and by 2030, the type of representation we want across technical and senior levels within our organization. And then another group is purely based on what we consider critical and scarce skills, which in our case happens to be in the technology space. And we've made it our business to understand what distinguishes these populations, what can we do in our offerings, in our employee experience to make it's a bit easier for those people to be attracted to come here, but also to want to stay. And I think it forces or requires organizations to hold a bit more lightly some of the things which maybe traditionally they are more attached to. So if a very basic example is when you talk about benefits and pay slips, you know, young people want more cash in their pocket. They might be like, I want to contribute less to my pension. How do you have a drop-down menu where people can actually make those kinds of choices, which might be more appealing? Of course, the older generation, we might be screaming like, no, you need to, you know, reserve your funds and you need to be planning for your pension. But the truth is, a 20-year-old is not thinking about their pension in the same way that a 50-year-old is. And do we have room to not just say, well, a pay slip is a pay slip and that's how it works, but actually say, let's have a drop-down menu for the young people? And that's just a practice. That's an example I could share. Women value flexibility. How do you, and not to say men don't, but it's through our own studies of lived experiences of men and women in our organization, it's well documented that women prefer or have a preference for flexibility, let me put it that way, for many reasons. And how do we sell that as a proposition in the way that we do things in the organization? And so we've built also propositions like what we call our care model. You know, if either people are going through menopause, menstruation, miscarriages, all sorts of things to just show that we actually understand the flexibility and the time and the things that you require. And that's not all there is to it, but just practical examples of hyper-personalization is about understanding your customer.
Yes.
And in this case, the customer is the employee.
Yes. No, you have explained it so eloquently, Njabulo, and to our listeners and viewers. So diversity is very broad, right? So as much as most of the time in our country, the focus or the attention tends to be on race and gender, but it is broad because, you know, the different generations, they actually then view diversity and inclusion in different contexts. But then people also want to understand, what does it mean for me as an individual, right? But let's switch gears, because you're sitting on the leadership seat, right? And having spent some of your time overseas outside of South Africa, but then let's talk about diversity in the context of leadership in Africa. You know, so especially in the African continent, you know, because sometimes it's all good and well that we travel to Europe, we travel to the US, and we do this and we do that. But then if you look at leadership diversity in the African continent, you know, so what does this mean for you in the space of actually interacting with other leadership voices in the African continent? In your experience, have you, you know, how do you collaborate in that space? Because I always say to people that we as South Africans, sometimes we forget that we're in Africa. And we tend to make that mistake, you know, because we see the world, you know, that there's South Africa and then there's the rest of Africa. You know, what does that mean for you? Because that's also diversity, right? So what does that mean for you in your leadership seat today from an African context?
Definitely, South Africa is very much part of Africa, and I think it's important that we always remind ourselves of that. When I think about leadership and diversity in the African context, I was smiling as you're asking the question, because one of the immediate thoughts that comes to mind, and you'll hear it a lot when you talk about African leadership, is patriarchy. You know, I think we are still a largely patriarchal society as Africans. And I think there is room for, you know, where we want and we embrace the leadership from men and the role that they continue to play. I think so. Gender for us is still, from an African perspective, I think it's about how do we crack that mindset that actually women can. Women have shown, even in traditional African settings, whenever you follow the stories from the north to the east, west and south, you actually understand the importance of the role that women play from a leadership perspective. But for different reasons, it's never been fully acknowledged. So certainly, I would say patriarchy and the gender agenda for me come to mind. And then an interesting one, just even when you look at it from a global perspective, people will zoom back to Africa and they say, when you talk about the youth dividend and the future of the world, actually, Africa, from a population perspective, you know, we have a young population. We've got a lot of young people just being born. And the question is, how much have we harnessed that to be able to position ourselves for future leadership? And we haven't done enough. South Africa alone, I mean, we've got a shocking unemployment rate, which should make all of us really reflect. And then you extend it to the broader Africa. You know, are the youth in a good place? And there's obvious things like brain drain, you know, Africans wanting to leave Africa. But how do we create that proposition that actually you need to be here, you need to be at home, and you need to be part of the solution? And I think from a leadership point of view, that's a little bit where we have a potential crisis. I don't think we're at a crisis point yet, but we need to consciously be developing young people. And then when you clash it against patriarchy, it's the older people hanging on to power. And I think that's the African story, you know? And I think that's all of the things we need to unpack to say the future lies with the youth. We want them to inherit this world from us. Are we happy with the world that they're going to inherit? And for me, that's our African issues from a diversity and inclusion perspective. And they're not the only issues, but certainly some. I mean, back to women. Unfortunately, Africa, we've got some of the worst GBV, gender-based violence statistics.
Yes.
So there's a lot of things to unpack there in terms of who are we as Africa and what do you want from an inclusion perspective.
Yes.
Yeah.
So my follow-up question, Njabulo, and thank you for answering this in this context, because then my follow-up question will be around women and these women empowerment programs, and then in the context of diversity, and the other one is around youth when it comes to mentorship and sponsorship, right?
Yes.
But let's start with gender
Yeah.
and women. That we belong in these communities and spaces where we're always talking about women empowerment, and if you go to organizations, they've got some women program or the other on whatnot, women in tech, women in telco, women in insurance, women, every sector has women in this program, right? So how do we actually then get to a point where we collaborate as women and actually stop putting labels on ourselves to say, no, you can only belong to this community if you're a woman in FMCG. So how do, in your ideal world, when you imagine women empowerment, the Njabulo way, let me call it that, so how do we get to actually then collaborate and have one voice around where we need to be as women?
Yeah. Sure. So much to unpack there as well. I think firstly, for me, I would love for a women empowerment approach that includes men. Firstly. I think we and to deviate slightly, but I'll come back to the question, as one of the emerging crises is the men and the boys. Where there's been so much focus and there continues to be so much focus on women and the girl child. But have we also brought the men and the boy child along to say, how do you coexist with these new empowered women with a big voice and who are now more confident and more sure of themselves, which is fantastic. But we all still need to coexist at the end of the day, because you say we all need each other. Men and women do need one another. We want men to be the allies for women. And so when we unpack that, and maybe that's a whole other podcast.
Yes, it is definitely. It's a whole topic on its own.
I want to unpack that. For me, how do we bring the men and the boys along? Because that's society at the end of the day. But I think on the question of women working together, I think, that's also for me would be part of my ideal world. Is over and over it's been proven that when we collaborate and when we work together, we just get so much more accomplished. And I do think we need to break the silos. I think some of the women empowerment silos, they've served their purpose now. I think by calling out industries where women were invisible, it's been good to say, women in finance, women in technology, because we know that traditionally those spaces have been occupied by men. But we definitely are at the point where we now just need to look at the gender agenda much more broadly. With the men, but also looking at women as a collective. And that's kind of my ideal picture. I think how we do it is just creating spaces like this, which there's so many intersections anyway, and that's what you find. I've found in my organization, we've got employee network groups, LGBT plus, disability, women, etc. But in youth, and we found that there's so many intersectionalities, right? Because you can be living with a disability, be a woman, be under the age of whatever, and so the intersectionalities are there. And we should be careful not to create too many deep silos. I think there's space for focus because there are specific issues that may affect a particular group. But then there's so much more from a collaboration perspective, just around issues that affect us in our human experience.
No, I like how you answered that question, because you actually remind me of so much of the episode that I did with the two ladies, Masha Mayaba and Dumi, where we're talking about women can, and that the table is big enough, right? right? Because even us as women, we tend to compete amongst ourselves, and actually, forgetting that if we collaborate on certain things, that we can achieve so much. We can create, we can bake more pies, so that we have more slices and there's enough for everyone. So you remind me of so much of that. Actually, I need to introduce you to Dumi. So she's the lady that did this Women Can event earlier this year. I think it was around, can't remember, about three months ago. And she had this big billboard somewhere in Sentin, and it was such an amazing event. So she was just talking to me about how she was surprised, the caliber of women that actually came into her space and attended the event and continue to be part of this community, executives and top leading women like yourselves in our country who came together and formed part of this community. So I was like, okay, when you do your 2025 Women Can, I'll introduce some more women. So I really need to connect you with her, please, because she's just really doing wonderful things. But let's come back to the topic, because I think I'm now going and my head is just starting to imagine what the new year would look like. Exactly. So, but let's come back. Let's talk about youth, right? You touched on the unemployment, and but let's talk about it in the context of mentorship and sponsorship. What has that done for you at your young, as the young Njabulo? You finished school quite when you were very young, so I'm assuming that along the journey you had some really good mentors, you had some sponsorships in the work environment, people that look at your journey and say, look, let me hold your hand, let's go this direction so that you can thrive, right? So talk to us about that, but then talk to us also in the context of where we are in 2024 and what mentorship and sponsorship would mean for our youth with the challenges that we face today.
Yeah, definitely one of my passion points.
Yeah.
I could have an entire discussion about it. It's so important. Coaching, mentoring, sponsorship. And I think, firstly, coaching and mentoring, they tend to be blurred. And I think there's definitely room for both. And in my career, definitely, I've had... maybe unpack it for us, Njabulo. So just to our listeners and viewers who are maybe, what is the difference between coaching and mentoring? I would say mentoring is usually someone who's been on a similar or same path as you, at least the one that you'd like. It's never identical, but someone who's walked ahead of you in terms of the things that you would like to do. And really, mentors tend to share their experience, but translate them into lessons in terms of what you could gain from that. And one of the things, and speaking about young people, is actually reverse mentoring, because young people also have a different lens in which they experience and understand the world. And how can, even if you've walked a path ahead, when you engage with young people, what could you learn about the world through a young person's eyes? Earlier I was mentioning that I've got a daughter, but anyone who has children that's part of the beauty of actually raising children, is you just keep on learning the world again, but through their eyes. And there is something in mentorship about that, in terms of there's those who've gone before and they can share with us. Coaching can be, I guess, walking along with you, and it can be more formal, less formal, in the sense that, you do have people who are coaches in particular capabilities and skills. One of the big topics in my team at the moment is about transition coaching, when people are promoted from one level to the other. Quite often, there's nobody holding your hand to say, well, now you're in the next level. What does it mean?
Njabulo, now you're talking about something else. I'm just reflecting. But now, Jenny, you just get promoted, boom, go and sit at the boardroom table. Anyway, continue. I'm telling you.
And how do we help people? And it's difficult, and for me, it's interesting, because when I'm wearing my professional hat and I'm advising the business, I can say, no, this is about transitioning. How do we coach this person, hold their hand? They were promoted because they were technically sound, but now they've got people issues or financial budget things to manage that they've never done before. But we all fall into the trap, because just last week I had one of my best team members who was recently promoted, and I was challenging her on just where a point of frustration where I expect them to show up differently.
Yeah.
And she just genuinely was like, that's where I'd love you to coach me. Because I've never led these kinds of people before. I've never done something like this.
Yeah.
And it's like, it seems like it's an obvious thing, but then you stop and you say, actually, yes, this is part of your journey.
Yeah.
So you've been entrusted with this new level, but you're new to this level, you know?
Yes,
And coaching can be about that. And there's all sorts of coaching. And again, we could spend the whole day on it.
Yeah.
But line managers are your first coach, which sometimes leaders don't recognize that. You've got people reporting to you. Yes, you can determine increase their performance ratings, but you're actually just also their everyday coach.
Yeah.
And how consciously do you do that to bring people along in terms of the journey?
Yeah.
And I don't want to lose the last one, which is sponsorship, because sponsorship is so underutilized, but is so important.
Yeah.
And because your question was also around the young people, I just want to start with the fact that you have to be worthy of sponsorship. So let me maybe also then unpack sponsorship, you know?
Please, yes.
Because if you have a sponsor, this is a senior leader.
Yeah.
Not necessarily your direct line manager. It could be your boss's boss.
Yeah.
It could be another leader who has visibility of the work that you do.
Yeah.
And this is someone who behind a closed door will vouch for you and say, of course Pam can do it. Of course she can get the promotion. I think she's amazing because actually, have you seen her podcast? And have you seen how she approaches X, Y, and Z and whatever?
Yeah.
So being a sponsor is incredibly important.
Yeah.
I often talk to my senior colleagues about that to say, are you championing people? Are you sponsoring this person?
Yeah.
What doors have you unlocked? But the part about sponsorship that's also important is the person being sponsored. You have to be worthy of sponsorship.
Yes.
If I'm gonna go behind a closed door in a boardroom and vouch for you and speak on your behalf, you have to be all of those things I've just said.
You better show up.
Young people don't appreciate that enough.
Yeah.
It's just about, we don't get opportunities here. You know, things are just passing left and right. Only X, Y, Z gets recognized and promoted. But if you were to do a self-reflection and you say, does Njabulo even have visibility of the work that I do?
Yeah.
Would she confidently, in all the competing thoughts in her mind, do I even come up? That's part of your role to make yourself visible to that person, you know, and to bring your best work to be top of mind for those people, for them to also have the confidence to say, actually, this person is worthy of sponsorship. Yeah.
No, thank you so much, Njabulo, because to our young people, I hope you are listening, because these are... I'm also talking to you, Sifanele. You've become my... I think very soon our listeners and viewers, they're going to know that I'm always sitting with a young man called Sifanele. But anyway, so thank you. So I hope you are listening, young people, because it's also about, as much as you want access to opportunities, you must then also be, in a space where you can show up, and so that people remember the work that you do and they actually recognize, what it is that you do and who you are. Right. So, Njabulo, how long have we been going for? I think we've been going for just over 50 minutes or close to an hour, close to 50 minutes. So before we close, so usually we go for an hour. So this is a good time to actually then, pick your brain just around, what message then would you have, for our young people when it comes to this topic that we are discussing today, evolving diversity and how they would need to understand diversity for themselves in the spaces that they are in, and also unpacking what is this phrase cognitive inclusion really, really mean, right? Because we know the differences, we are black, we are white, whatnot, but, how would they, embrace diversity for themselves, and what is then the meaning, the practical meaning of this term cognitive inclusion?
Okay, I'll start with the cognitive inclusion.
Yes, yeah.
It's really... as I mentioned earlier, it's about embracing the invisible. So it's about the different ways in which we add value, in which we contribute, in which we show up. So it could just be even something as simple as Some people are more creative and think out of the box.
Yeah.
Some people are more traditional in their outlook and how they do things. I think cognitive diversity is about appreciating that for all of us to show up and thrive, you need an element of belonging. And I say an element because I guess the controversial part is always about, well, this is not home. You can't just do whatever you like.
Yeah.
And I think that's fair.
Yeah.
And for me, that's part of my message to young people. At the end of the day, when you are part of an organization, just like if you're part of a sports team, you're part of a choir, in fact, even being a part of your family, there are ways in which things are done. So this is certainly not about it's a free for all, you can do whatever.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, each organization has its own mission, ethos, what it's about, the purpose that it's trying to achieve. So one of the important things is how aligned is my purpose and how I want to do things to this organization. That's always a great starting point.
Yeah.
But understanding at the end of the day, I'm going to be a part of a team if I'm going to be in that organization. And it could be in a traditional sense of we are a team reporting to the same manager, or just a team in an organizational sense of I'm part of something bigger than myself. And that requires give and take. So one of the big sayings is always about youth is wasted on the young. And it might sound negative or derogatory, but what it really means is sometimes some of the best things about being a young person, the energy, the passion, the excitement, young people don't always have the maturity to really unleash that in a positive way. And so for young people, there are things that will always come with being young. Impatience is one of them. When am I going to grow? When am I going to be promoted? When am I going to make more money? When am I going to be a boss?
Like instant results.
The instant gratification. So I would say patience is important. As a young person coming up in your career. And with the diversity and inclusion lens, I would also say patience and education. So older people, older generations also can be schooled and they can learn. Of course, the willingness must be there.
I don't know how to say that in English. Please try and
Absolutely. So that's probably also a message to the older generations, not just to the young people. But since you asked me to, I think it requires both. So both of us need to be patient with one another. And we need to educate each other. And the new world of work requires that we co-create. And that's why I even refer to the reverse mentoring. If you're a senior, older person, how are you challenging yourself to stay relevant and fresh? And do you have enough young people around you to really give you a good sense of the smell of the place and the things that are really happening in the world around you? Because we can really sometimes as older people be in a bubble. But again, as young people, we could be so impatient and wanting things to be in a particular way that we miss the opportunity of the wisdom. So one of my leaders, his favorite Zulu saying is indlela ibuzwa kwabaphambili.
Yes.
And I always say, that's true. But it's true. It is true. It's factual. And I think it's about both of those, as you said, to say the older people, they need to learn and be open to still learning. But also, abaphambili, they were there for a reason. And they've also learned lessons that money can't buy. You can read all the journals, you can YouTube, you can TikTok.
If you haven't experienced it.
For however long. But if you have actually not experienced it, my team quite often now, when they say, Njabulo, how did you know they were going to ask that question? You asked us to add did they tell you? And then they like, for them it's like magic. Like, you just came this morning and you said we must add the slide, and they asked that question, but it's instincts and it's experience to say, actually, did we think about that issue? Maybe we should also add this angle. But I've also been burnt before when I was asked a question and I was like, I don't know what the answer is. So you're not born knowing. It's the hard lessons. And if you can listen to the older person or someone who's ahead of you, you don't always have to pay the same school fees. Some things you do need to experience yourself, unfortunately. That's why sometimes you must let the baby touch the stove and they know it's hot. But if you can avoid it, try to learn from other people. And that's really, for me, The world is changing. The future always belongs to the young people, no matter how much as the older people we try to hold on to it. And it's always about how do we co-create each other so that as the older people, we are happy with what we're handing over, but also for the young people that they really are educating and coming along with us to say we can create this new future together. Yeah.
So you've heard it from the lady herself. So Njabulo, let's talk to the HR professionals.
Yes.
You know, just before we close, let's talk to the HR professionals. Firstly, what did it do for you winning CHRO of the year 2022? So that was 2 years ago. And what did at that moment when they announced your name and we're going through the process, you know, this is an intentional question because you will continue to be an inspiration for HR professionals, but for business leaders as well, you know, in your field. But what did that do for you, you know, for your brand, you know, for your personality, and also when you reflect, you know, and you know, what would you say to an up and coming HR professional who's asking you this question?
Yeah.
You know?
Sure. So I would say to up and coming HR professionals, I think when I reflect on the CHRO of the Year award, it was such a full circle moment for me. I think, again, having started as this 19-year-old, yes, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, you want to change the world like all young people.
Yeah.
You pay a lot of school fees, as we call them, along the way. You get disappointed. You get disappointed by corporates, by bosses, sometimes the work that you're doing, sometimes the reaction from the organization. You know, HR is not so important. This is the core of the business. This is what we need to be doing. I once worked in an organization where the core of the business was economists. And they used to just think HR people are a waste of time. And I remember that was about 10 years into my career, and I almost changed my entire career because I was like, I don't want to be part of this insignificant thing, you know. But very quickly came back to my senses to say it's not a competition. At the end of the day, if you think of puzzle pieces, we're all here to contribute something. And what's important for HR professionals is to remember what you are here to contribute. We're not here to compete with the core of the business. We're not trying to be the revenue generators. We are very proudly the custodians of the people agenda, and we're gonna show up in the best way possible for that. And so for me, that award was very affirming. It meant all the times when I stood up for HR, for the people agenda, it was worth it. It was it all came together at the end of the day. There was recognition of how all the puzzle pieces were fitting together, and just really encouraging. And I also like what you said is also beyond being an HR professional, because as you stay longer in corporates, as you become more senior, you actually become a business leader. And for me, I always brand myself as I'm a business leader. And gone are the days where business leader just equals revenue generator. If you're in a commercial organization, business leader is exactly that. You're leading the business. And you understand that my contribution is around the people agenda. How do we shape that? How do we revise that? How do we keep it close to the heart of everything that we do? Because it's part of the bigger picture from a business perspective. And I think just, it was really affirming from that perspective.
Thank you so much. You know, I think we are now exactly on an hour, and we could go on. So I don't want this to turn into a 2-hour episode. But Njabulo, thank you so much. Thank you for coming through. Thank you for gracing us with your presence. Thank you for opening up your heart and your mind, and just sharing aspects about yourself that people wouldn't ordinarily, you know, get to know. So it also is the reason why we started this podcast, was for exactly for this purpose, to make sure that our young people, entrepreneurs, get to experience, you know, corporate executives, successful entrepreneurs, and actually have access to part of their stories, because they wouldn't ordinarily have a chance to sit down with you like this. So this podcast is that platform that enables that connection, right, between our young people, young entrepreneurs, mainly from marginalized communities. And people always say, no, why do you always emphasize this thing about marginalized communities and disadvantaged? access, because I'm a product of, I come from a rural place where, you know, access was an issue, access to certain things was an issue. So this is something that's very, very, very close to my heart in terms of, you know, in our spaces, you know, as we continue to grow and succeed, how do we go back and share and give back and share information, right? Because sharing doesn't always have to translate to money, but you can always share your time, share your information, because this is also part of mentoring and coaching, you know,
absolutely.
because people, once it's recorded, it's there for a lifetime, right? People can always go back to it and listen to it and listen to it. So thank you so much for coming through. So to our viewers and listeners, you've been listening to episode 22 with the inspiring HR leader of our time in South Africa, Njabulo Mashigo. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence, and thank you for being so graceful as well.
Thank you so much,
You know,
Pam.
so I know that the year is over. We are tired, so you must have a wonderful break, Christmas break, festive break. Enjoy the time with the family. Thank you for coming through.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Yes. You're now listening to the Diversity Roundtable. I'm Pamela Xaba, entrepreneur, inclusion enthusiast, and the founder of Nonkosi Creatives with over 2 decades as a corporate HR professional. My goal is to give you insights into conversations with entrepreneurs and corporate professionals who have insightful stories of triumph and leadership. I uncover my personal journey from cultivating diversity and promoting inclusive communities. We'll also find out why building a prosperous society is vital for leadership roles. Subscribe and get ready to rise, lead, and help define the spirit of South African excellence.